Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, people in the room and those watching on YouTube, you're all very welcome. Well, it's a pleasure to welcome Charles Spicer to Selwyn this evening to talk to us about his book, Coffee with Hitler, a Telegraph and Spectator Best Book of the Year, apparently. So Charles read history at Selwyn between 1984 and 1987, and in his book, he credits Selwyn historians, including three who are in the room tonight, John Morrell, Gordon Johnson and David Smith. He credits them with inspiring him in his historical studies. Nonetheless, he abandoned academic history for a while, pursuing more worldly business pursuits, before a triumphant return to academic history. He undertook doctoral research at the Institute of Historical Research, the culmination of which was a PhD, and then the publication of his research in the form of this extraordinary book. I won't even try to précis it or comment on it. Suffice it to say, I have devoured it and absolutely loved it. Indeed, it's one of those books where I feel sad, I feel grief-stricken that I finished it. I won't have it to look forward to when I go to bed tonight. But the critics have had the same reaction, describing it variously as fascinating and deeply researched, compelling, meticulously researched, fresh thinking, calm and emphatic. And reviewers have also pointed to its contemporary significance. It is a warning from history that remains terrifyingly relevant today. So I won't say any more, but we'll hand over now to Charles, who's going to talk about the book for about 20 minutes or so, leaving plenty of time to take questions from people in the room. Charles.
Thank you, Janet, for that very kind invitation and for inviting me this evening. We should all be thankful I wasn't here yesterday trying to give this talk because I had no voice at all. I'm still a bit croaky, so if I start grabbing for the water, I apologise. But I had a wonderful time as an undergraduate studying history at Selwyn. So really is a treat and an honour to be back here. After an indolent first year, when my attendance at the CD Library was intermittent at best, I was gently persuaded by my tutor, John Morrell, and my Director of Studies, Gordon Johnson, to buckle down. With their patient guidance and that of exceptional supervisors that they had tracked down, I then left Cambridge with a respectable degree. But, as Janet alluded to, the size of my overdraft necessitated gainful employment rather than further academic study, so I forged a career in business, focused, perhaps rather surprisingly for a non-scientist, on the medical sector. Nearly 30 years later, helping my two daughters with their history homework rekindled my interest in the subject, and I conceived the idea of a book. Recognizing the rustiness of my research skills and weakness in my writing, I wondered if a part-time PhD might fill those gaps, and duly enlisted at the Institute of Historical Research at the Senate House in London. That in itself was a properly challenging undertaking, but I recommend it to anyone as a very effective way of both teaching an old dog new tricks and giving a later-in-life first book, some credible academic rigor. But Coffee with Hitler is not a PhD thesis edited for publication. Rather, it's a narrative history book based on the primary archival research I undertook for the doctorate that was supervised and examined by leading historians. As such, I'm hoping to have my cake and eat it by trying to appeal both to serious academic historians, such as yourselves, as well as the more general history-reading public. Now, given that the 1930s is arguably the most studied decade in the last 2 centuries of European history, we might assume there are few unstudied primary sources and little new, fresh, or original to say about the period. But my experience was the opposite. Patient digging unearthed plenty of lost or overlooked material, some of which was just up the road in the Churchill College archives. And the more that is written is about the 1930s, and the more that is turned into films or TV drama, the greater the extent to which popular myths are embedded, facts distorted, and therefore history diminished. The producers of otherwise enjoyable films, such as Darkest Hour or TV series like Downton Abbey or The Crown, feel the need nowadays to take such degrees of artistic license and such liberties with the facts that those watching can leave the cinema or the sofa with a dangerously skewed perspective. My book's narrative starts in 1934 and runs through to the Nuremberg trials 12 years later. It tells the story for the very first time of three amateur British intelligence agents who wined, dined, and charmed the leading German Nazis. Working together, they hoped to avert a second war in Europe by building rapport with the Third Reich politically, diplomatically, economically, and socially. The vehicles for this unusual mix of amateur diplomacy and intelligence gathering were two friendship societies, the London-based Anglo-German Fellowship and its sister organization in Berlin, the Deutsche English Gesellschaft. With support from royalty, aristocracy, politicians, and businessmen, they hoped to use these two organizations to engage with the Nazis. They were financed by large British companies, including ICI, Unilever, Dunlop, and Thomas Cook, with support from most of the banks and insurance companies operating in the City of London. In parallel, these agents gathered intelligence on the vulgar and maverick National Socialist regime, which they used to educate the aloof British government. By exploiting the natural cousinhood of the two countries, and particularly the German admiration for British culture, they initially hoped to entice Germany back into the European fold and welcome her alarmingly ambitious leader, Adolf Hitler, into the pantheon of respectable international statesmen. In short, they wanted to civilize the Nazis. At the core of the story is the relationship between these three Britons and their close connections within the National Socialist leadership. The first, Philip Cromwell Evans, was a left-wing pacifist Welsh historian and political secretary. He came from a modest background as the son of a master tailor from Carmarthen in Wales. From the grammar school there, he got a place at Jesus College, Oxford, where he studied modern languages and was quickly fluent in French and German. Now almost completely forgotten, he at various times advised no less than 6 British prime ministers, from Lloyd George to Anthony Eden, on how to deal with the Nazis. It was Cromwell Evans who choreographed the controversial 1936 meeting in the Bavarian mountains between Lloyd George and Hitler. When Cromwell Evans died, excuse me, aged 76 in 1968, Martin Gilbert, later Sir Martin Gilbert, the Holocaust historian and Churchill's official biographer, in a condolence letter to Cromwell Evans's niece, wrote, "He played an important part in our history, and sooner or later it will be recognized. He suffered more than anyone I knew from the sneers and accusations of those who did not know his true achievements. When I first met him, I was one of those who believed that he had betrayed his country. Over the years, I've collected evidence absolutely refuting these charges. To the contrary, he did things for our country of which no man need be ashamed, and few could parallel." My second protagonist is Ernest Tennant, OBE, a wealthy, conservative, butterfly-collecting Old Etonian businessman and Great War veteran. A surviving member of that golden generation of young Edwardians, he was hard hit by the war and the rise of communism, such that both traumas defined his worldview thereafter. Tennant's loss of family and school friends was extraordinarily high. By 1916, 7 of his male relations, including his beloved younger brother, and 19 of his fellow school prefects had been killed in the war, only 2 years into the beginning of the war. He was one of the first 3 British officers to enter Berlin after the armistice, having been sent by his government to report on conditions in the war-shattered city. The Allies had instigated a naval blockade to prevent goods getting into the capital and maintained it well into peacetime. Estimates of the unnecessary post-war civilian deaths this caused are still subject to debate, but run into the hundreds of thousands. This legacy tormented Tennant for decades. Writing 20 years later to the Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, he described seeing starving children in hospital with hunger madness. That's the condition where they would hide any food they were given to save it for later when they knew they would be even more hungry. This had driven his determination to rebuild friendship between Britain and Germany. And finally, Group Captain Graham Christie, CMG, DSO, MC, a pioneering Great War fighter ace, diplomat, and intelligence agent. He was the epitome of the gentleman amateur, a character from fiction in the mould of John Buchan's Richard Hannay or in Fleming's James Bond. Apart from a short obituary in the Times, written by his nephew, and sporadic mentions by specialist historians, his story is still largely untold. Following school at Malvern College, where he admitted to being lazy, Christie moved to Germany, where he became fluent in the language and qualified as an engineer. He was an avid mountaineer and skier, and according to his family, taught Captain Scott to ski for the famous expedition to Antarctica. Christie was one of the first people on the planet to undertake powered flight. He commissioned his own monoplane in 1913 and toured the north of England, giving displays to enthralled crowds, most of whom had never seen an aircraft before. When war was declared the next summer, he donated both his private planes to the army and enlisted as a humble second lieutenant in the nascent Royal Flying Corps. 4 years later, he finished the war a wing commander, having flown combat missions throughout, shooting down Zeppelins and pioneering tactical bombings, as well as leading the first squadron to undertake night flights targeting infrastructure well behind the German lines. The first time he went out to do tactical bombing was the Battle of the Loos, and he was about a mile above a key train siding. He's in a plane, to give some context, which weighs about the same as a horse, and he's got an 8-stone bomb, which with no bomb releasing technique, so he has to heave it out of the plane and drop it down from a mile. And he hit it was a long bunch of train wagons, and he hit them directly. And what he didn't know when he dropped it on them, that they were entirely full of explosives. So the explosion, apparently, luckily he was a mile up, because if he'd been any lower, he probably would have been taken out. And that had a huge difference. But I think it's supposedly, according to the experts, was the first time tactical bombing in the middle of a battle as opposed to strategic bombing. Anyway, I love that anecdote. Together, these three almost totally forgotten men infiltrated the Nazi high command deeper than any other spies, relaying accurate intelligence to both the appeasing British government and to its anti-appeasing critics. Between them, they witnessed first-hand key landmarks in the rise of the Nazis, having dinner with Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, the evening before the Night of the Long Knives, joining white tie celebrations for the anniversary of Hitler's release, the 10-year anniversary from Hitler's release from prison, alerting Whitehall 24 hours ahead of the remilitarization of the Rhineland, riding in the Führer's cavalcade at the Nuremberg rally, warning the British Foreign Secretary of the invasion of Czechoslovakia, plotting with the German resistance to overthrow Hitler, and briefing Winston Churchill and Anthony Eden a few days before the outbreak of war, and finally negotiating between the British government and the German resistance once war had been declared. Now, between them, they befriended Hitler's three most Anglophile and socially aspirational sidekicks. Firstly, Joachim Ribbentrop, the wholly unqualified champagne salesman who disastrously persuaded Hitler to appoint him firstly as the German ambassador to London and then almost inexplicably as Germany's foreign minister. Initially a passionate Anglophile, Ribbentrop had spent a happy year in 1909 in South Kensington, learning English, and he was so fluent it was said his German had a British accent. His admiration for England's culture, its royal family, and for London was deep-seated and sincere, but also aspirational and obsessive. Ribbentrop's journey from passionate Anglophile to sworn enemy of the UK is a central theme of the book, and I'd argue one of the key drivers in the path to war between the two countries. Secondly, we have Hermann Goering, president of the Reichstag, commander of the Luftwaffe, avid art collector, and field sports enthusiast. Also an ardent Anglophile, Goering admired, indeed aped, the English upper classes with his passion for hunting and shooting, as well as extravagant country houses. He lobbied to be sent to London to represent the Führer at the coronation of George VI, but was nixed by his arch-rival Ribbentrop. Later, there were plans to bring him over to watch the Grand National at Aintree and to shoot pheasants at Chatsworth, the Duke of Devonshire's stately home in Derbyshire. Unlike Ribbentrop, Goering never fell out of love with the English and would always have preferred to avoid war with Britain, albeit on his own terms. He maintained several discreet communication channels with the British government right up to and beyond the outbreak of war in September 1939. The third key Nazi in the story is the bizarre and eccentric Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess, Hitler's closest companion and scribe for Mein Kampf when they were imprisoned together in the 1920s. He'd spent his childhood in Egypt and was, by Nazi standards at least, an internationalist. Now he's best remembered for his quixotic peace mission in May 1941, height of the war, when he flew solo in a specially adapted Messerschmitt fighter over 800 miles from southern Germany to the Duke of Hamilton's estate near Glasgow, in the hope of negotiating a peace between Hitler's Germany and Churchill's Britain. Though he later tried to claim otherwise, the Duke of Hamilton and his family had been closely entwined with the Fellowship, and Hess was well aware of that association. I argue in the book that it was the Fellowship that Hess was targeting by flying to Scotland, and this was why he chose that particularly Germanophile ducal estate, when there were at least 4 ducal estates further south, also Germanophile, which would have been much easier to get to, materially closer to Germany. So, how were these improbable relationships built? The Anglo-German Fellowship recruited, to a degree never fully acknowledged, distinguished supporters from both British and German royalty, the British aristocracy, and 3 fighting forces, especially the Royal British Legion, and around 100 politicians from all parties and both Houses of Parliament. By the summer of 1937, it had over 700 members, and the membership, which was previously lost until I discovered it, the membership list reads as the great and the good. To date, the Fellowship and its champions have had a mostly very bad press. One writer painted a picture of a knot of peers adrift in an uncongenial world united by paranoia, pessimism, and panic, who blamed the misfortunes of that time and of their times and class on an immensely powerful but clandestine Judeo-Bolshevik global conspiracy which could be thwarted only by fascism and Nazism. Another dismissed the organization's members as a mixture of English fascists, appeasers, anti-Semites, hard-headed businessmen, fanatical anti-Bolsheviks, eccentric aristocrats, and neurotic Mayfair society women. At best, these men and women have been lumped together with the guilty men of Munich. At worst, roundly condemned as fellow travelers of the right. Such powerful stereotypes have been perpetuated in literature, most famously in Kazuo Ishiguro's Remains of the Day, as well as popular films and TV drama ever since. Now, the Fellowship did throw elaborate banquets welcoming senior Nazis to London, such as the dinner held at the Dorchester Hotel in honour of their Royal Highnesses, the Duke and Duchess of Brunswick, cousins of the British royal family, but still committed supporters of Hitler. We have pictures of that. You see the swastikas on the table, decorating the table at the Dorchester Hotel. Alongside the cream of high society at that dinner was the Fellowship's newly recruited head of publicity, famous Cambridge alum Kim Philby. Though only recently graduated from this distinguished university, he was already a Soviet agent. It has been widely assumed that he joined the Fellowship primarily to divert attention from his known communist activities at the university. I argue in the book that his work with the Fellowship was much more than a smokescreen. Stalin was personally obsessed with the risk of an Anglo-German alliance against Russia and wanted any such activities monitored closely. It was Philby, by then employed by MI6, who briefed Stalin on Hess's arrival in Scotland, which the Russian leader saw as the first step in a dastardly plot against him. The Fellowship also The Fellowship also escorted distinguished Britons over to Germany to see Hitler's regime in action. Groups would go out for the National Socialist Party rally held each September at Nuremberg, and an extra-large contingent, including dozens of MPs, went out to the Berlin Olympics and were entertained royally by the leading Nazis, who each competed to throw ever more lavish and sophisticated parties. The high point of their efforts was the meeting they arranged in September 1936 for Lloyd George to visit Hitler at his Alpine retreat in Berchtesgaden. Escorted by Cromwell Evans, the former British Prime Minister travelled out by train, he hated flying, with a large entourage, including his son and daughter, who were both also Liberal MPs. They were warmly received by Hitler, who hero-worshipped Lloyd George for having won the Great War, and was genuinely delighted to see him. This would prove to be the high watermark of the Fellowship's successful summer of diplomatic marriage broking. As Lloyd George's biographer wrote, face to face were the statesman who had dominated the First World War, leonine with flowing white hair, a still bewitching figure, and the restless magnetic personality of Hitler. There's a fantastic picture of it in the book, and you see this Edwardian British politician and Hitler, much 20 years younger, and a completely different style of clothing. The contrast between the two eras, the two cultures is fascinating. Now, as Albert Camus said in 1947, it is always possible to record the social conversation that takes place on the benches of the amphitheatre while the lion is crunching the victim. My book's title and the recurring food and drink motifs are in no way meant to seem flippant, nor to trivialize the horrors of Hitler's regime. While it's easy to accuse those who broke bread with the Nazis of supping with the devil, food is the oldest diplomatic tool, and these social interactions offer us intriguing glimpses into the belly of the beast. By charting Europe's descent into the war from a new perspective, Coffee with Hitler challenges conventional interpretations and popular tropes around British dealings with the Nazis, Munich, Mosley, and the Mitfords, as you might say, to ask whether the Anglo-German Fellowship and its champions have been examined in the wrong context or tried in the wrong court. This is not, however, another book about appeasement. Appeasement in the sense of one nation making concessions to the demands of another to prevent an escalation of hostilities is essentially reactive and passive. The civilizing mission, however misguided, of the leaders of the Anglo-German Fellowship to charm, cultivate, and connect with the new regime was proactive and dynamic. On a practical level, the Fellowship's first principle was to make trade, not war. This path was smoothed by both the National Socialist ideological veneration of Britain and her empire, and by their deep-seated anxiety to avenge the patronizing sneers of the old German elites and international critics. So by consciously taking civilizing rather than appeasing as my central theme, I have tried to move beyond the fevered debate around appeasement that has now rumbled on for 8 decades, and to explore what alternatives there might have been to Chamberlain's, in my view, particularly misguided handling of the threats posed by Nazi Germany.
Thank you very much. So, if I may, I will abuse the chairperson's chair to ask the first question, and then we'll open the questions up to the floor. Do we have the microphone that's chucked around? Good, just as long as that's ready for the first question. I wanted to ask you about something that you finished with. The book is very unequivocal in its stance about Chamberlain, I think, that you really do think he was a disastrous appeaser. And it's not that long since I read, admittedly, a novel, Munich, by our other famous alum, Robert Harris, who, I mean...
famous other alum.
Yes, perhaps. Who admittedly, fictionally, presents a much more positive view of Chamberlain as trying to buy time for Great Britain to rearm by making getting his piece of paper from Hitler. So I wondered, I mean, that's clearly not your view.
I tried very hard to have a more positive perspective on Chamberlain, and colleagues, former tutors here will know that it's part of a PhD one's put through the ringer, have to read all the secondaries. So I went through the original guilty men's school, then there's the revisionist school, there's a post-revisionist school, there's a post-revisionist school. It's yo-yoed back and forth for 80 years. And I think that Chamberlain was horribly maligned by the publication of Guilty Men, and I talk about that in the book, and it was cruel and unpleasant. But having spent all this time, about 10 years, looking at this, I do think that he didn't take advice. And his letters to his sisters, which was his way of sort of keeping a diary, effectively diary letters they call them, they do reveal someone who's sort of overweening sort of self-confidence that wasn't based on anything. He wasn't taking advice. I think there have been some subsequent prime ministers who perhaps haven't taken advice when they might have done, but I wouldn't make any comparison. And I think I don't buy the argument that he bought us time, because the Germans were rearming very energetically at the same time. And I'm particularly upset that he didn't give the Oster conspiracy more oxygen, because I think he'd had a very real chance of succeeding. And everyone knows about the bomb plot. They don't look at the Oster one, which in 1938, which not only logistically did it have better chance of succeeding, they'd secured the police force in Berlin were on their side, and all of the military units around Berlin, so north of Germany. And what do I know? But if you want to unseat a government and you've got the police force, and I just don't think that the military from Munich could have come up and tried to sort of do a north-south battle. So I think if they'd arrested Hitler at that point, and they were completely undermined by Chamberlain getting on his plane with his umbrella, because that briefly made Hitler look like a man of peace. They definitely needed Hitler to invade Czechoslovakia to give them the casus belli. So I feel sorry for Chamberlain in certain ways, and I do make the point that there's in the book, and I made other talks, that there's about 1,000 biographies of Churchill, and you can count the ones on Chamberlain on one hand. So I tried to be sympathetic, but in the end I do think he and Neville Henderson in particular, whereas I'm quite happy being revisionist about Halifax. I think he changed his mind. Admitted he changed his mind too.
Thank you very much. Right, who would like to ask a question? Yes. Can we throw you the bouncing microphone? Whoa.
In the grand scheme of the Second World War and the lead up to the Second World War, what was the impact that these men had on the outcome to Europe, to the world? What effect did they have?
In the grand scheme, virtually nil, except that they did provide the British government with an awful lot of information. So, and they're being quoted in cabinet papers as experts. Their intelligence was coming straight through. The reason they didn't have more effect than they might have done is that the government didn't act correctly, arguably, on that intelligence. They got the intelligence, and previously people have perceived that they and other people supplying information into the British government were ignored or unheard or not listened to. They were actually listened to. It's fascinating. You actually see them referenced in cabinet papers, which is unusual. You wouldn't normally name a source in a cabinet paper. Just, we understand that. So they were definitely getting through to the right people, particularly through Robert Vansittart, who was head of the Foreign Office for 8 years and then the chief diplomatic advisor. So they were getting through, but Chamberlain wasn't listening to them. But I'm afraid not much of an effect. I mean, I do make the point. It's one of the books a bit like that film Titanic. We know what happens in the end.
And it's still a page turner.
Yeah,
I mean, that's quite impressive. Who's next? Yes, let's go to the front first then.
Who?
This gentleman here with the grey. Hang on, you need to wait for the microphone. Sorry. There we are.
So thanks for a fascinating talk. I'm intensely interested in your revelations about their negotiations with the German resistance. It was the subject of my first book. And what I wanted to ask, the people you mentioned were sympathetic to the Nazis in a way. When did they have a turn or ideological turn towards the resistance? And was it an ideological turn?
That's a really good question. I think they were appalled by them. There was a certain point when the mounting brutality became too much, and they switched from being loyal Germans who were excited by the idea of a stronger Germany, and suddenly realized that Hitler's path was only heading towards hell. But there's two characters, the Koch brothers, who are particularly interesting, and they worked very closely with my protagonists. And in their case, and they were Foreign Office, old German Foreign Office, Wilhelm Strasser. They were always pretty skeptical, and I think you have to think about a lot of Germans that they go from being snobbish and sniffy about this Austrian corporal to being faintly alarmed, to being horrified. And it's difficult to map that, and to the whole debate around whether there were any good Germans and stuff like that. And I sort of leave that judgment. I'm not a German speaker. I haven't studied enough of the German primary sources to have a judgment on that. And I think it's quite a fraught area. But certainly the early historians were far too, and Vansittart and Hugh Trevor Roper and people like that, who basically wanted to insist there was no such thing as a good German in the era. But then, with some justification, there were an awful lot of people in the Foreign Office claiming, of course, we were always part of the resistance. So it's a fraught area. You obviously know it well.
Thank you. Who's next? Just behind you. Could you pause? There we are. Thank you.
Thank you. You began by talking about the discrepancies between popular outlooks and historical opinion. In my sense, my taking the popular opinion of appeasement in this country is very much that there was kind of this popular surge for impeachment in the 1930s, especially among the upper class, this kind of broad desire represented in these kind of organizations. And yet when I go back in books on the topic, and I'm thinking of Ian Kershaw's book, Making Friends with Hitler. I think your title is slightly better, by the way. I'm struck by how much when these kind of activities like the Anglo-German Fellowship were reported at the time, there was a sense, even in the early mid-1930s, of kind of public scandal, of moral contagion by dealing with the Nazis that it was reported on. There was almost kind of obsequity if you were a top-level person meeting with German leadership. So do you kind of agree with that? Do you think that's been left out of historiography? What does that say?
No, I mean, for me, I argue in the book that the tipping point is kristallnacht. It is that any interaction with Germany was arguably defendable at the time, and certainly the Anglo-German Fellowship. I mean, it was seen as very respectable. Its dinners were written up in the next day's Times. The speeches repeated. Lord Halifax comes to the Christmas dinner a couple of months before he becomes Foreign Secretary. People who were consistently anti-appeasement, like Vansittart and Churchill's family, they come to the dinners. So that's the dichotomy I'm really trying to expose in the book. That this shouldn't be lumped in with the obviously pro-Nazi organizations like the Link, like the Nordic League, like the British Union of Fascists. This was much more mainstream. And the reason it's got confused is it's complicated, but of course you can imagine everyone tore up their membership cards when so its existence got somewhat brushed under the carpet, and it was finding the full membership list or series of membership lists and really analysing. Churchill's son-in-law, Duncan Sandys, was a member. Very respectable people were. It did a lot with the British Union, the British Legion. It was mainstream. And the chief of the general staff comes to Gort, comes to one of the dinners. It was very respectable. Now there was at the time press coverage of atrocities, brutalities, unpleasantness to a range of different communities in Germany at the time. But, that was happening in other countries as well, including, as Alan Allput's book, Britain at Bay, he makes this point, which came out after mine, but maybe it came out before mine, but after I finished it. Excellent book. Makes the point that, that Britain was doing some pretty unpleasant stuff in Palestine and Ireland, and obviously in the US you've got stuff in the Deep South. These were brutal times. There were bad things happening, and that the press coverage was comparable between these different, if you see what I mean. So they weren't directly associating it with these guys as saying, you're appeasing brutality. If that's really what you're talking about. Does that make sense?
Yes. Can we pass
So my question is more about, like, if we extrapolate from what we the protagonists you mentioned in your book, how do you think like the intelligence service works now? Like, we've also dealt with Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi and really, really vile men since Hitler. So do you think how British intelligence approached their dealings with these people was quite similar with what you mentioned in your book?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think there's a seminar group at Corpus Christi that we sort of debate that every Friday afternoon, don't they? I think the interesting area to look at is the amateurs versus professionals. And so my lot were all, some of them had some professional background. They were operating as amateurs. They were not paid. And MI6, or SIS as it would normally be called in those days, had no contact with Goering, had no links in, and was remarkably underfunded in its investigations to its links with Germany. So the quality of intelligence was poor, and I fear that hasn't really changed. I think that I think our intelligence services remain underfunded. Our Foreign Office, of which MI6 is essentially part of, is woefully underfunded. I'm told we spend about half what the French do, similar sized country, on that. And ignorance isn't bliss. Intelligence is immensely useful, and if we can learn that from history, that's quite and persuade our politicians it's worth investing in. Just knowing what potential enemies might be up to, because the British government was so sort of. Hitler had been Chancellor for 2 years before any British politician or any cabinet minister even went to see him. They were in and out of Italy seeing Mussolini. It wasn't that they had an issue with him being a dictator and like that. They were dealing with all the other dictators. They looked down. They thought he was a passing fad, I think.
Thank you.
Yes.
I can't catch, so that's a relief. Do you have a sense of the extent to which the Nazis were looking to exploit these three protagonists, and the sense to which they were aware of that and were, as it were, responding to it?
That's a really good question, and certainly to an extent, they were certainly trying to exploit them in terms of their ambition to persuade Britain not to make war, to be a sort of willing dupe. The sort of argument, you keep your empire if you let us do what we want, our evil plans on the continent. So they saw that as an opportunity. What I show in the book is that they become increasingly frustrated with my trio and their colleagues refusing to be dupes. I haven't even talked about Lord Lothian, who ends up becoming the British ambassador to Washington. He's working quite closely with him. They arranged for him to do 2 meetings. He'd been Lloyd George's private secretary in the First War and actually drafted the guilt clause in the Versailles. Lothian initially is wildly enthusiastic about Hitler's peaceful intentions, but I show he actually realized he was completely wrong much earlier than even his biographer gave him credit for. And they then got frustrated because Lothian was no longer a dupe, but they certainly had ambitions to do that, as you suggest. And there's a certain amount of feeding of misleading information. But actually, now it looks like, particularly Graham Christie, who was getting all this information about how many fighter planes they were building, Goering just couldn't help but show off. So that actually looks to be pretty accurate. It gets quite complicated in all the numbers and the estimates, but and he did give really accurate intelligence, you know, including calling up Vansittart on a Saturday morning, saying they're going to remilitarize the Rhineland tomorrow morning, on the Sunday morning. Hitler liked to do all these outrages at weekends because he knew the British elites would all be at their country homes. I mean, it's laughable, but it's true. I mean, he really planned it that way because the British government just couldn't react fast enough. They would generally bunk off sort of midday or after lunch on Friday, not come back till Monday morning. But it's a very good point.
Can I ask another question? It's very striking for someone based in a university that there don't seem to be any academics involved in the fellowship, the Anglo-German Fellowship at all. Was there any involvement with the university sector?
I'd probably have to send you back to my PhD thesis for that, because the answer is that there was. And it's a very interesting question you asked that. It didn't make it into the book because they weren't, no, actually the Master of All Souls, Oxford, certainly came to one of the, so there were a number of academics, including a handful who frankly held ideologically pretty unpleasant. I mean, of the membership, about 5%, 1 in 20, have been tracked down as holding far-right, anti-Semitic, pro-Nazi, or any combination thereof views. And that's work, because Richard Griffiths, who I think you would have known, who was once of this parish, he did 3 books on this. So it's been quite helpful. Once I got the membership list, not just the members, but also all the people who came to the lunches, it's quite well known which major British figures held those views. Obviously, you can't prove a negative. You can't prove that someone who, Joe Smith, we can't prove they weren't. But Griffiths did brilliant work in the early 70s, I think, was he doing on, which is Fellow Travellers of the Right, is his first book, and then he did 2 follow-up ones. So we do know, and as I say, only about 5% held that view. So that's the sort of prosopography work I did in my thesis, was to demonstrate that it really wasn't on balance. I mean, that's most organisations. 5% of the membership probably hold views you don't like. Also, I point out there were more Auditorians than there were pro-Nazis, but there were probably a few. There were probably a few pro-Nazi Auditorians as well. But,
Thank you. Let's have some more questions. Yes. Now, where's it gone? The little. Okay, you ready?
Jerry.
Excellent.
Thank you. Wonderful book, wonderful talk, fascinating, gripping book. And it feels when you read the book that things are changing all the time. And I'm wondering, in a strange sort of way, when did you choose the word civilise as their mission? Because it's not a very clear picture at any one time that they're dealing with, whereas civilise suggests a sort of focused idea of what they want to achieve. And when did that word emerge in your mind as the word to describe what you feel they were doing?
it's a very good question. It emerged quite late, and it was actually someone who was helpfully reading an early draft, and he said, you know, this I'd used the term, but he said this civilized thing, because it is a great alternative to appeasement, because appeasement is such a, and I do have a little bit of analysis, I haven't gone into it in depth here, but it's such a loaded term now. It wasn't up until 1938. Appeasement was a perfectly respectable diplomatic strategy, but because now it's used by modern politicians as sort of as a cheap shot, it's weaponized as a term. It's actually very hard to write a book using it all the way through. And the civilized thing, it came out of the sort of food and drink and the trade and that sort of thing. I see those as all parts of, and they're still doing events in 1939. They're still trying to opening new branches of the Deutsche English Gesellschaft in regional cities. So there's still aspects of that. But to some extent, as you're perhaps hinting, it's a literary device, but it seems to work.
Yeah, interesting.
Hopefully not a dishonest one.
Mike.
Thank you. Charles, you talked about the sort of traumatic experience that some of the individuals who were motivated to do this, that they had as a result of the First World War. And arguably the experience for the French was even more traumatic. I mean, was there any sort of equivalent movement in the French, amongst the French, aristocracy or whatever, or was this just a peculiarly British approach to dealing with the rise of Nazism?
No, there was. It's a very good question, Mike. I mean, there were other such organisations. There was quite a lot of similar activity in France, and I'm not sure how aristocratic it was, but it was. I mean, it was more trade-based. There was a Dutch-German Fellowship equivalent, which someone's done a PhD on, but it's in Dutch, and that's not my strongest language. So there were parallel organisations, and there'd been similar ones in Britain prior to this one. The long-standing tradition. In the 1930s, people loved organisations. Everyone belonged to all sorts of different associations and clubs, and they were springing up. And so there'd be a long history of that type. The French one is, interesting. There was an interesting article in the Jewish Chronicle. A distinguished historian whose name I can't immediately remember, but probably now in his 80s or 90s. The French aristocracy were very anti-Semitic, according to him, and he's written a comparative study of looking, and this sort of tradition you get in Remains of the Day that there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the British aristocracy. His argument, and he's a Jewish historian, is relative to the French. So in France, you've got the whole sort of post-Dreyfus. That gets quite complicated, but that's sort of beyond my pay grade and takes one into Vichy and all sorts of dangerous areas, I think.
Thank you.
John has a question. John. Right, you're going to have to catch the ball, John. The square ball.
I don't get to catch it. I get
No.
But what about the Duke of Windsor? And how does your research throw any light on what's going on with him? Because that's another very contentious area, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, he comes into my story because he gives this speech in 1935 in June at the British Legion. One of the better things that the Duke did was serve as president of the British Legion. He did fantastic work with First World War veterans. I mean, he actually did pretty good work during the war. He bicycled around the trenches and stuff like that. And he enjoyed interacting with soldiers and veterans, that he felt relaxed in their company. And he gives this speech in 35 saying we should reach out the hand of friendship, and gets a huge ticking off the next morning from his father, who basically accused him perhaps quite reasonably of interfering in government diplomatic policy. But that triggered a delegation from the British Legion go out, and they meet, and it's the great and the good, the leadership of the British Legion go and meet Hitler. And so that features in, and he never came to any of the events, but his cousin, the Duke of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, comes over and sees him when he's king. So he's woven into my story. I chose not to talk about his visit to, I mentioned it in passing, but I don't have a chapter on his visit to meet Hitler, because I didn't really think I had anything new to say about that. There's lots of quite sensationalist, rather annoyingly, after I'd chosen the title and sent it to the publisher, someone's brought out a book called Tea with Hitler, which is substantial, and it's got a picture of the Duke and Wallace on the front, and it's about their visit. My own personal view, having read quite a lot about Duke of Windsor, is that he wasn't ideologue at all. I don't think he had the intellectual firepower. And his main reason for going to see Hitler was that he really wanted a state visit for Wallace. And he was so bruised by the whole abdication. And I'm not his apologist or his defender, but anyone would be bruised by the trauma of what he went through in 36. And he wanted, it was a sort of last fling of having given up. I mean, he was king emperor. I mean, it was a hell of a thing to give up. And I don't think And then you get this sort of, there's all the complexity around Portugal and Spain and getting out, and I mean, his judgment was atrocious, but I don't think he was an ardent Nazi, although people are still writing books claiming that.
Well, I think that's important testimony, because it is difficult to get a real stable position of him. I suppose if he wrote his autobiography, it would have been called Not the Spare.
Not the Spare, yes. he did write his own book, King's Own Story, which also used a ghostwriter. It's quite well written. I actually quote from it. He's quite funny about his father and all the things that his father disliked. His father bullied him horribly. But, I mean, to give you, it's quite an intellectual group here, I'm sure. One doesn't want to come across as a intellectual snob. But if you think that his, great nephews, the Prince of Wales and the Spare, both secured places at a relatively academically successful major private school. The Prince of Wales, as he then was, didn't just not go to any major public school. He went to Dartmouth Naval Academy, where he came second bottom. So, he just didn't have intellectual firepower to sort of think about this sort of stuff. He was a flippity-gibbet, I think.
Who's next?
Can I?
Yes, of course.
I mean, apart from all the nice things that have been said about your book, about it being a real page-turner and all of that, which I endorse fully, a great strength is the very sort of subtle judgments you make about key individuals, particularly those who have been stereotyped in other books, and or in the general history. Lord Lothian is an interesting case. But when I was reading it, I somehow, I don't know how, I'd always thought that Van Sittart was really a much more decent man and a more intelligent man than he does emerge from your book. Is it just because he somehow becomes very ineffective? He's head of the Foreign Office, and then he's getting all this good intelligence, but he's then not persuading anybody that it.
He gets very frustrated, and I think he basically has a nervous breakdown.
Yeah.
If one can use that term in the war.
Yeah.
And develops this Vansittatism. I mean, you read it as a narrative, his life, it's very disappointing, because he's a titan of a figure. I mean, he's exciting. He was a great playwright. He entertained on lavish style. He would be enormous fun if he came in here and gave us a talk, and which is very uncivil servant at the time. They were normally, that would be left to the politicians, and he's just so unpleasant. And what he does at Nuremberg, the way he stitches up the courts, and I don't think there's any debate about that. And he is part of this, but Trevor Roper and Wheeler Bennett, they all collude in this. There's no such thing as a good German. When he was actively, I make the point, he was actively supporting them to do that. It was appallingly disingenuous. But genuinely, I thought he was a fantastic character. Just at the end, he lets one down. But he was, when he gets pushed upstairs to be chief diplomatic advisor, he then feels very frustrated, and he writes these very sad letters, with my love to you both. It's very sweet. And he dies quite soon after the war.
Well, I think we have... have we reached the end of our time? We have reached the end of our time. I'm very sorry. I've been given the gesture of... So, on behalf of everybody watching on YouTube and everybody here in the room, I'd like to extend an enormous thank you to Charles, not just for writing this brilliant book, but in particular for coming and talking to us today and then answering our questions so intelligently and sensitively. So can we all show our appreciation in the traditional way?
Thank you for having me.
You're very
It's
welcome.
been great. Thank you for coming.
Getting the gesture from the head of development because we've got 5 more minutes as far as I'm concerned.